The Muslim Brotherhood Terrorist Designation Act of 2015 recently passed through the U.S. House Judiciary Committee, the first step towards reaching President Obama's desk. CCTV's Jim Spellman is here now with the latest. And Jim, what exactly does this proposed law entail, and where does it stand today?
The bill lays out a sort of history lesson about the Muslim Brotherhood, making an argument that the group is essentially no different than terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. Sponsors of the bill say countries like Russia, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia have already declared the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, and so should the United States. Here's one of the bill's sponsors in the U.S. House of Representatives, Congressman Bill Johnson.
They are one of many of the terrorist organizations that are funding the war on terror, sponsoring the war on terror throughout the world. Since their beginning in 1928, they have become more and more radicalized over the years. Today, they fund Hamas, Al-Qaeda. These are organizations that have an established goal of killing Americans, destroying the American way of life.
The sponsors of the bill want the U.S. State Department to assess the Muslim Brotherhood and either declare them a terrorist group or explain to Congress why not. If this becomes law and the State Department does designate the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist group, it will give the U.S. government wide latitude to crack down on the group.
It'll give the State Department the authority to freeze assets that the Muslim Brotherhood might have here in the United States or other American-controlled territories, and it would also make it illegal for U.S. companies to deal with the Muslim Brotherhood on business, and Americans that try to support the Muslim Brotherhood, it'll be a crime. So it's the same kind of thing that would apply to Al-Qaeda or ISIS or any other organization that's already been designated a terrorist organization.
As you mentioned, the House version of the bill has made it out of committee. The Senate bill has not. Hard to say if this bill will ever make it to a vote in either chamber on it.
And Jim, what is the attitude in the United States towards the Muslim Brotherhood?
You know, I think that not a lot is really known about the group in the United States amongst the general public, but they are becoming a part of the political debate as the U.S. presidential election heats up. One of the sponsors of the Senate version of the bill is Ted Cruz, a Republican candidate for president. The sponsors of the bill say recent terrorist attacks in California, Paris, and Brussels have created an environment where the bill has a good chance of passing.
Okay, thanks, Jim. That's CCTV's Jim Spellman reporting. Joining us now for more from Cape Town is Ebrahim Rasool. He is the former South African ambassador to the United States. With me in the studio, Sahar Khamis is a professor of communications at the University of Maryland. And from Denver, Nader Hashemi is director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Denver. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Ambassador Rasool, let me start with you. So here we have an organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is actually a political party in Egypt. It won a democratic election in Egypt before it was overthrown by the military. What do you make of the fact that there are certain members of Congress here in the United States who want to classify the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization?
I must say it will be most unfortunate, and it will be a great mistake if State Department were to follow the ruling by Congress that the Muslim Brotherhood should be designated as a terrorist organization. At worst, it would be a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that young people who feel angry about the coup, young people who feel angry about the reinstatement of a dictatorship and their dashed hopes for democracy and human rights, that they will then begin to see who will take the fight to Sisi, who will take the fight to the West far more militantly, and I think that they may choose Daesh or ISIS as their premier organization for the expression of their anger. I think that Congress is making a grave mistake. I hope it is not simply one of those things that they are posturing about for the election, but certainly I think that we do not need to find more recruits for extremists. We need to, in fact, cut off the supply for recruits to extremists. We need to make sure that there are enough legal, non-violent avenues to register the amount of protests that are justified in that part of the world.
Nader, the Muslim Brotherhood is a huge organization in Egypt. It has millions of followers. What is the status of the Muslim Brotherhood right now in the country? Because we know that there has been a huge crackdown on its members. Have they gone underground?
Well, they're basically all in prison. The leadership of the organization is in prison. Human Rights Watch reported recently that there's approximately 42,000 political prisoners in Egyptian prisons, overwhelmingly Muslim Brotherhood members. The organization has been banned. It's been targeted for annihilation, largely as a result of the policies of the El-Sisi government, but also supported and financed by other authoritarian regimes in the region, primarily Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who fundamentally fear the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood are challenging authoritarian regimes in the region. And that's why there's been this attempt to completely eliminate them from the political scene. But of course, the consequences of this, as we've seen before, and as Ambassador Rasool has just pointed out, the consequences of the attempt to annihilate and eliminate the Muslim Brotherhood is that it will simply fuel and further radicalization in the Middle East, in Egypt, and we're seeing that playing itself out right now before our eyes.
Sahar, what do you think is behind this move to classify the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization?
Thank you so much for having me again on the show. Always a pleasure to be on the heat. And thanks for asking me this particular question, because I think it is really a byproduct of the overall environment and climate that we are witnessing right now here in this country. The very vicious and very dangerous wave of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry and anti-Muslim hatred that has been surfacing in the rhetoric of some of the political candidates in the presidential elections has been appalling and extremely dangerous. And really, I think that this move is a product of this overall environment of anti-Muslim sentiment and Islamophobia. My fear is that we're going to go down a very dangerous, slippery slope here. I totally agree with the two other respected guests on this show and everything they said about, fueling extremism and radicalization even further, because every time you suppress certain groups or label them or stigmatize them or create a fear of them, they start to be pushed to go underground. And every time you start to push them underground, that becomes a very fertile environment for violent extremism to emerge. So this is a very dangerous, slippery slope. Also, it might widen the umbrella for labeling and stigmatizing any group or movement that might have any kind of Islamic orientation or leaning, which is, again, a dangerous thing to do.
Ambassador, one of the candidates for president here in the United States in the Republican Party, Ted Cruz, he says that there is a string of evidence that shows that the Muslim Brotherhood supports terrorism, that its aim is to wage a religious war, a jihad against its enemies. Is there any evidence to support that?
I think that truth has been the greatest casualty in the Republican primary election, and so this must be taken with huge bags of salt. I think that the overall history of the Muslim Brotherhood since 1928 points only to one or two incidences in its entire decades-old struggle against Egypt. In fact, the Brotherhood in Egypt had taken a parliamentary route even under Mubarak. The Brotherhood in Egypt was a reluctant participant at first in the Tahrir Square uprisings. The Brotherhood reached out to the military to its detriment when it was the governing party of Egypt. And so I think that, like many other things, we cannot expect that Ted Cruz or any other Republican will put up, but they certainly also won't shut up. And I think that the onus is on him to produce the evidence that he has, rather than ask for the evidence of nonviolence that he expects of the others. I think that very clearly, what we need to deal with is the aftermath of a series of difficult mistakes that the United States had made in relation to Egypt. It bought peace for Israel by propping up a dictator at the cost of billions of dollars per annum. It said President Obama went to Cairo after he was elected. He called to the Egyptian people to rise up for democracy and for human rights. And when they did, he made his third mistake, and that is to tacitly support the coup d'etat by General Sisi against an elected government. And I think that if the US goes through with this move on the basis of spurious evidence, then they will be committing the most fatal mistake that Egypt can't afford to have, and certainly that the region cannot afford to have.
Nader, there is another way of looking at this, and that is if the United States goes ahead and classifies the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, Why should Egyptians care about what the United States thinks about its political parties? In other words, what is going to be the practical effect of the U.S. going ahead with this move?
Well, I mean, Egyptians shouldn't care. They have their own problems to deal with, and they shouldn't have to deal with the rhetoric coming out of the Republican Party. And I just want to speak to the centrality of Ted Cruz and the Republican Party to this particular story. There's a backstory here that is important for your listeners to know. This attempt to label the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, a threat to American citizens, really goes back several years when approximately 3 years ago, 5 Republican members of Congress wrote letters to senior departments of the American government that deal with security and intelligence, claiming that the United States was facing a new and dire threat to its existence, and that threat was coming from the Muslim Brotherhood. And they claimed, and they fingered in this letter, they pointed to the name of Huma Abedin, who is an American-born citizen and is also the chief of staff to Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State at the time. And this letter by these Republican congressmen and women claimed that because of Huma Abedin's influence and her alleged ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, that the American government was facing this unique threat. And now, of course, what happened is that leading American senators, such as John McCain, took to the floor of the Senate and publicly repudiated this witch hunt, this attempt to take the United States back to the 1950s. Analogies were rightly made to the McCarthy era and the communist witch hunt that took place. And so this speaks to these, the fact that what we have in the United States today is these very powerful and influential lobby groups that are well-financed and very influential in the Republican Party that are pushing this agenda forward, that are getting these ideas disseminated, and of course organizations like Fox News and various websites, and also I want to highlight here various right-wing pro-Israel Likudnik organizations are financing this narrative, and it has sunk deep roots within the American political culture. And you have people like Ted Cruz publicly announcing that individuals such as Frank Gaffney, who is really sort of the intellectual architect of this narrative that the Muslim Brotherhood is taking over the United States, are now on his foreign policy advisory team. Yes. And this speaks to, I think, what the underlying sources of the fundamental groups and organizations that are pushing this legislation, of course backed and supported by various lobby groups from Arab authoritarian regimes that I mentioned earlier in my comment.
Go ahead, Sahar.
I want to really add to what has just been mentioned now, because it's very important. We have to put things in context and perspective. I totally agree that this has roots, going back many years back, because there has been this attempt to really stigmatize a number of organizations that have an Islamic or Muslim label or name, including, for example, CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations, for example, and many other organizations, to put them on a list of fear. And CARE, published this report calling, Islamophobia the manufacture of fear. Certain groups definitely are investing in this, industry of creating fear and labeling and stigmatizing certain groups by making claims like they are fostering radicalization or extremism or, violence, or they have links to Hamas, or they are somehow supportive of Hamas, and so on and so forth. And the list can go on and on. And in many cases, these claims are unfounded, and in many cases, they are not based on any true evidence or any facts that can really be tangible. However, they do fall under the cloud of fear and the environment of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry that we have been talking about earlier. So it's very important to put this move within this broader context.
Right, and Ambassador, I want to just raise the point that you brought up earlier, and that is when you clamp down on political groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in a country like Egypt, you actually send its members underground and possibly on the path to radicalization, as Sahar points out, and possibly into the arms of organizations like Islamic State. And we've seen evidence of this, haven't we?
No, I think that the evidence is enormous. I think that some of those countries have suddenly seen the rise of ISIS in places like the Sinai, Tunisia, where we've had certain pushbacks on the Arab Spring, supplying quite a number of people to ISIS and so forth. And this is the direct result of a demoralization and a deep mistrust that has developed in the democratic system as a whole. I think that when elected governments are overthrown and the West turns a blind eye to it and begins to support not only the dictators that come in their place, but then the dictators design to demonize their opponents as terrorists and to link them with ISIS. This is a crisis for democracy in a part of the world that needs democracy and human rights the most. When you condone torture, in Egypt, you condone the kind of barbarity that we see in ISIS. When you condone the absence and the overthrow of democracy in Egypt, you condone the idea of a totalitarian caliphate by ISIS. And this is the language that Congress at this point is speaking to the most fragile part of the world. And I think that we need to ask them to really rethink their overall strategy. But if the strategy is, as Professor Sahar has said, that it is indeed to allow for dealing with Muslims in a particular way, for the Middle East in a particular way, for propping up dictatorship, then I think that we've got to call it out and we've got to say what it is that is afoot in the world today.